What's up and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Roman political system. But before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Just so that we're all on the same page, the specific moment of the ancient Roman world that we're going to be talking about politically speaking is the Roman Republic. If you don't know, the political landscape in Rome does change, I would say, really 3 times. Okay, so it starts off from the founding of Rome to about 509 BC as a kingdom, which had a king at the forefront of it. This doesn't go very well, and so this gets abolished in 509, and then the Republic is set up, which is, again, what we're going to be diving into today. Now, then after that, in around the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus, we then set up the Empire. For today, we're going to be focusing on how the political body of ancient Rome worked during the Republic. So that means that the first and probably most important thing that you need to take away from this video is to understand that ancient Rome was split into 2 major classes. Now, technically it is 3 because the third one are slaves, but because they don't have any voting rights and because they don't have any voices whatsoever because they are seen as gum on the bottom of everybody's shoe, which is lovely to think about, we are not including them. The 2 main classes of ancient Roman people were the patricians and the plebeians. If we start with the patricians, these were the upper class of Roman society, right? So think the people who are from the most noble families, right? They were born into the right family, they had the right name, they normally had acres and acres of land, incredibly rich people. Those are the patricians. Then we have the plebeians, who are everybody else. So as you can see, the vast majority of people in the ancient Roman world would have been classed as a plebeian. However, the majority of the seats in the Senate, which was the ancient Roman political body, were given to the patricians. The Senate as a political body, before we get into the specifics, could not pass laws without consulting the general public. Okay, so even though the Senate were the top dogs of the city, they absolutely had to go back to the people. They could not just be passing laws willy-nilly. What they could do is put forward motions to one another, discuss those things, and decide what went forward to the people. So individual senators as well, they didn't have specific power. So even if they were walking around the city, they couldn't say, because I'm a senator, I want X, Y, and Z. That's not how that worked. They were powerful as a group, but they were also not like supreme power as a group, because everything did have to go back to the general public, which I will discuss the technicalities of what that means, because the people who were the lowest of the low, even if they were, full citizen plebeians, they were not really getting a say. When the Senate was established right at the start of the Republic, there were around 100 members. However, this ended up growing to a senatorial body of around 300 during the time of the Gracchi brothers, and then up again around the time of Sulla to 900, 800 members, and then up again during the time of Julius Caesar to around 1,000 members of the Senate. Until we then get to Augustus at the start of the Empire, where he made a cap that only 600 senatorial members could be part of this legislative body at one time. So even throughout the Republic, the numbers changed quite a bit. And if you heard me say any of those numbers and you're like, well, I wasn't taught that at school, the numbers do vary, so don't worry. And they do get specific depending on what text you read. So if you're reading a specific ancient text and they've said different numbers, always go with what you're reading. But across the board, that's sort of the discrepancy in numbers. So if you think about the majority of those seats were going to patricians, it was not exactly fair. When one was voted into the Senate, your role as a senator was for life. And this was unless, there is always a caveat, but unless you were charged for a crime or you did something really horrible or whatever it happened to be, you could be ousted. But the idea of being elected into the Senate is that it was a role specifically for life. So with great power comes great responsibility. What are the roles in the Senate? Within the Senate, there were specific roles that you could take on that would then mean you had specific powers within the community, is what I will say. Now, powers, obviously, that makes it sound more like Spider-Man or something like that. I just mean that you have different jobs depending on your role. And in order, those at the bottom start with a quaestorship, you then go up to an aedile, then a praetor, and then the consul. Now, there are 2 other roles that are in there, but they're not as commonly mentioned. You then have censors, and just at the bottom as well, you have what is then later known as the tribune of the plebs. The first role that got you elected into the Senate was a quaestor. A quaestor was in charge of financial and administrative affairs. So this is the first introductory role that you would get into the Senate. However, there are some odd technicalities when it comes to the ancient Roman Senate, and one of them is that even if you were elected as a quaestor, which I'll explain how these things were elected in like a hot second, but if you were elected as a quaestor, you technically weren't a senator until one of the censors added you to the list of senators, because the censors were really the people that had the job of adding people to the Senate list and also taking them off. So you could have been a quaestor, theoretically, you could have been a quaestor, but if a censor didn't add you to the list, you weren't a senator. You were just a quaestor, which obviously eventually you would be added to the list anyways, but there you go. The role above that comes as an aedile. You were in charge of games, government business, that kind of a thing. But the aedileship was just one above the quaestorship, and one above the aedileship, you were then made a praetor. Praetors were the judges of Roman law. They were sort of in charge of like civil administration, justice, that kind of a thing. And they were technically, I guess you could call them like deputies to the consuls. So they directly spoke to the consuls and they worked with the consuls. And the consuls, as top dogs in Rome, this was the most prestigious position that you could get to. The 2 consuls were elected by the Romans, which again we'll get into exactly how they were elected in 1 second, for a 1-year fixed term. To be a consul normally meant that you had great military prowess, and there were 2 of them so that they could basically check one another. Remember how I said that they had a kingdom, and the Romans didn't like the kings at that time during 509 when it was all abolished. They decided no more kings ever, and so they established this role of consul where 2 people would be in charge only for 1 year, and that way they had the power to veto one another and keep them in check, so no one had ultimate power. Now, the point of having 2 as well was that if there were military campaigns that were taking place abroad, one consul could go and one consul could stay in Rome. However, during times of extreme military emergency, which I know I just made sound a little bit silly, but like this happens a lot in Roman history, especially during the Republic, both consuls were needed elsewhere. And therefore, there was another position. I just realized I missed out the tribune of the plebs, so we'll get back to that in one moment. But there was another position that was known as dictator. And this is not under any circumstances to be used in the way that we use dictator today. This was a very, very specific military position, which if, like I said, both consuls were outside of Rome, the 2 of them could elect one person who would have ultimate power within the city. This is normally an incredible military general or commander, and they were given a fixed term, which normally, generally speaking, was around 6 months. Obviously, this does change. And if you know anything about Julius Caesar, he ended up being a dictator for life. So this does, again, there are nuances throughout all of Roman history, but generally speaking, the role was in place for 6 months maximum in case, and only if, both consuls were outside of the city and could not rule Rome from within. Now back to the tribune of the plebs. The tribune of the plebs was designed to make sure that the voices of the plebs were being heard in these Senate meetings. So you could then just be voted in as a quaestor or as a tribune. So it's one or the other which would start your political career. Now, entry into the Senate was not actually seen as the end goal for many Romans, that actually to be elected as a quaestor or as a tribune would be the first step. And being on this roster, like I said, came down to the censors. The censors were a role that would oversee the registration and taxation of citizens specifically. So obviously, as I mentioned, that they were appointed with adding and removing senators who maybe misbehaved or new senators to come into this. However, they were specifically, as you can kind of guess from the name, they had to monitor the census, which was making sure that they had a note of how much every single citizen was worth all the time to make sure that everybody was getting taxed appropriately. Okay, so how was everybody voted into these specific roles of the Roman Senate? This is where things get a little bit tricky, because the way that people were voted into the Senate and voted into the quaestorship, and then the way that the aediles were voted for, and then the way that the consuls were voted for, depended on the public assemblies. There were three main public assemblies that everybody was sort of shifted into depending on wealth and social status, right? Everything really comes down to both of those things in ancient Rome. These three public assemblies start at the top with the century assembly, followed by the tribal assembly, and lastly, the plebeian council. The century assembly was a military assembly, right? So these are the soldiers and the ex-soldiers, the people who had fought for Rome or who were continuing to fight for Rome. They were specifically tasked with electing the censors and the praetors. The tribal assembly was made up of all the Roman citizens, basically. This specific assembly was responsible for electing only the aediles and the quaestors. And then the plebeian council, which is the bottom, they were the principal assembly of the plebeian class. Remember how I said that even though the plebeians were the majority of the Roman people, they did not have as much of a say as you would assume or that you would hope that they would. This is the prime example. So we're not going to do any more of that, but what I think is really important to acknowledge, obviously the people meant a very select few people, and more specifically, no women. So that is everything that I have to say as an introduction to the Roman political system. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.